We have a lot of conversations about how to advance carbon capture and storage, or CCS, technologies. This conversation is all about the why. Why do it, and why we need to do it. The Boundary Dam project in Estevan, Saskatchewan was the first commercial-scale carbon capture project on a coal-fired power station. But that project didn't just build a carbon capture plant. It also built an organization aimed at sharing lessons learned and driving the global adoption of carbon capture and storage technologies in the form of the International CCS Knowledge Center. At this year's GHGT 17 conference, co-hosted by Emissions Reduction Alberta, we introduced a business stream for the first time, expanding the conference's usual technical focus to include broader strategic conversations about the value of CCS and the path to final investment decision. It's those conversations that inspired today's episode. We wanted to understand what motivates industries to adopt carbon capture and sequestration, how Alberta and Canada are positioned to lead globally, and what incentives are required to make CCS projects not just feasible, but attractive for major sectors like oil and gas, cement, and steel. So we sat down with James Fann, President and CEO of the International CCS Knowledge Center, to explore what it means for Canada to remain at the forefront of this industry and why CCS is essential for a low-carbon future. To discuss not just the how, but the why. Here on Carbon Copy. So James, can you please start by telling us a bit about your background and how that led you to your current role at the International CCS Knowledge Center?
So I started my career about 25 years ago in oil and gas at a company called Alberta Energy Company, and I spent about 20 years working in oil and gas across all the different sectors. After that, I actually spent a year and a half after my career ended in energy. I moved on to the federal government because I wanted to look at opportunities to try to impact and make changes within the energy sector as it evolves towards cleaner technologies. I had a colleague at the International CCS Knowledge Center who contacted me looking at this as an area of growth, and there would be a good opportunity with some of my background and skill set to apply it to this growing sector.
Can you please just take us through really quickly the mission and focus of the International CCS Knowledge Center, particularly in regards to how you advance carbon capture utilization and storage globally?
A bit of history with the Knowledge Center. It was started roughly a year after Boundary Dam was completed. So Boundary Dam was the first commercial scale carbon capture project on a coal-fired power plant. SaskPower and BHP had decided to create this organization to really share about lessons learned and try to advance carbon capture. Our mandate largely remains the same, where we look at our opportunity to accelerate the deployment of carbon capture through sharing of lessons learned from our projects that are happening around in Canada. We really think that it's crucial to take all the experience that Canada has and work with organizations to help support their journeys forward as they implement these projects.
Great. It's such an important mission, and I think at ERA we're very familiar with doing first-of-kind projects and the fact that when you do a first-of-kind, you fundamentally learn a lot about what to do, what not to do. And so I think it's so important to have organizations like yours that take those lessons learned and share them out with the broader community. So from your perspective, I know you've had, a storied career in the oil and gas sector. We were just talking earlier about how that's given you a really interesting perspective on CCUS and on sort of the technological imperative. So can you just take us through, in a couple of bullets, your perspective on the importance of advancing global CCUS efforts?
The opportunity that we have in Canada is, in the oil and gas sector, it has many of the common technical skill sets that are required to implement many of these projects. Coupled with the great geology that we have, a world-class regulator, and organizations that can help new early-stage technology developments in this area, there's such a huge formula and opportunity for Alberta and Canada to be leaders. We really think that it's such a unique time for the deployment of a lot of these things. And that's why I look at a lot of the perils I had in my oil and gas career. Oil and gas has had a huge track record of innovation, developing at scale, and rapidly evolving. And I very much feel that what has happened in the past lends itself to the opportunities that it has in the future, not only economically, but a lot of high, well-paying jobs for Albertans and Canadians as we look and deploy more projects in the province. But also when you look at cross Canada, there's opportunities in Saskatchewan, in Eastern Canada, in BC. This is a huge opportunity for Canada to continue to be a leader in this space.
Yeah, very well said. And I think it really, I totally agree with you that it really evokes the legacy of the development of steam-assisted gravity drainage for in-situ production in the Alberta oil sands. And at the time, the technology was nascent. There was debate. There was folks saying, we shouldn't do this. Let's just focus on what we know how to do already. And it took a lot of folks like yourself with that vision and that question of what if this actually works, to take that technology and actually push it to commercial. And now we've seen how successful it's been. And so I do completely agree with you that CCUS is at a very similar inflection point, and we're going to need smart people, again, pushing it to keep advancing it. So what I'd like to do now is take our listeners through a bit of an overview of the CCUS landscape, and in particular your view on Alberta and Canada's role in that landscape. So can you maybe reference that Canada is a leader in this area. How do we compare on a global stage? We know there's a few nations and jurisdictions that are leaders. We certainly like to consider ourselves a leader. How do we stack up, and how have we gotten to that position of leadership?
Yeah, it's very important to recognize that Canada is viewed as a leader, and among the U.S., Norway, and U.K., I actually think are all viewed as leaders in this area. It's often forgotten there's very few operating carbon capture projects globally, and I think we have two of the best examples with Boundary Dam located in Estevan, Saskatchewan, Shell's Quest project, and not to mention the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line that was constructed by Wolf Midstream. Those are huge ways to show leadership, but also we continue to emerge with technology companies such as Savante, Entropy, who are really taking their scaling. And again, we've had such a great system with organizations like Emissions Reduction Alberta, Alberta Innovates, to help nurture an ecosystem to drive for the next generation. Many of these projects globally are still working on their first solutions to inject their first ton of CO2. So it shouldn't be lost that projects that have been operating 10 years with lots of experience, great geology, those things are really crucial to helping accelerate that. And Canada has done an amazing job in sharing what they've learned with the world, and will continue to do that to help advance other projects, because this is a global problem that we're all trying to work on.
Yeah, really well said. And I should give a plug. We are recording this episode at the GHGT 17 conference here in Calgary. And as part of the conference, we are actually taking a number of the delegates from the over 1,500 delegates internationally. We're taking a subset of those on a number of tours of basically all the facilities you just listed in Alberta. So we're really excited to use this opportunity to show off Alberta and Canada's leadership to the world.
Yeah, to mention as well, I never want to forget, there's so many companies that you always often will leave some out. You don't want to forget the Clive project that Enhanced Energy has. Aquastor also has a huge history and lots of monitoring in those wells. Test facilities, test networks. So I apologize in advance to any listener that I've forgotten as a partner, but there are so many quickly emerging opportunities and technology companies, and it lends itself back to the amazing, talented skill set that really makes it conducive for this technological advancement that's required in this sector.
So, James, we know that at the International CCS Knowledge Center, a big part of what you folks do is talking to companies that are interested in CCUS or trying to understand the opportunity and how it might apply to them. So you've seen a lot of maybe behind the scenes of what companies go through when they're thinking about a CCUS investment. Can you maybe speak a little bit to what you've learned about how companies make that decision when they're deciding where to locate their CCUS projects, which CCUS projects to prioritize globally, and how some of those decisions get made?
Yeah, excellent question, Chris. It's very diverse in how different organizations look at their their projects. The cement sector is a global sector, it's a global commodity, and many of them have lots of global assets. And I think when you look at all the different advantages and disadvantages that different regions have, that will really play into how they look at their projects and their portfolio of opportunities in front of them. I think with cement and steel being global commodities, they look at it quite differently than oil and gas. Oil and gas has an advantage with having actual geologists on staff, but they have a greater understanding of technical, so their technical risk is probably a little different than how some of the sectors that a lot of these things are net new. Regulatory regimes across the globe matter. Proximity to storage matter. So there's so many different factors and complexities that when you look at an individual project that a company is looking at, their decision criteria can actually be quite different. The harder parts for some of these is that CO2 as a commodity is different from a financial perspective than many other commodities that are produced. And so if it enables something that will help de-risk a project, that will also be a consideration. And so ultimately speaking, you have to convince someone who has shareholders, who has a board of directors, to make an investment, a material investment, for first-of-a-kind technologies in many cases that will have to actually be de-risked, or the risk needs to be managed across all the different parts of the value chain. So when I really do think about each organization, they're actually quite unique in how they look at it, and the sectors are also unique. So why a company may or may not progress is always going to be different, and I think it's important to recognize that. But at the speed at which projects are advancing and being developed, the amount of learning that can be shared and the speed of a no decision that turns into a yes decision, those things can happen very, very quickly. And I want to always be very optimistic that as projects are getting built and developed globally, it just lends itself to a huge opportunity for people to move into this area as somewhere they can spend their careers and develop these projects and have a great impact to the society and reduction of CO2 being emitted into the atmosphere.
Emissions Reduction Alberta takes action on climate change and supports economic growth. Our funding helps new and existing industries in Alberta reduce emissions while lowering costs, attracting investments, and creating jobs. That's why, since 2009, we've committed $884 million into 246 projects valued at $7.1 billion in public and private investments. To learn more, visit eralberta.ca.
So next I'd like to move on really to the heart of our conversation today, which is not so much the what or the how of CCUS, but the why. So let's dive into that. What are the driving incentives for industries like oil and gas, like cement, like steel, to invest in CCUS technologies? And what do you see as the ultimate goal of those sectors investing in this technology pathway?
It's really important to focus on the why. I think we often, through being technical people or looking at projects, we look at, returns, how much does it cost, and de-risk. But the goal is still to take CO2 molecules out of the air. And it's also important to distinguish there's a big difference between a CO2 reduction, which is taking less CO2 out of an emitting project, versus a carbon dioxide removal. And I think those two things go hand in hand for our ability to move towards a net zero goal that many countries have had. The incentives are kind of interesting because there are amazing incentives that have been provided by the governments with the intangible tax credit locally, the Alberta Carbon Capture Incentive Program, ACIP, as well as organizations like the ERA and Alberta Innovates helping with early stage funding to de-risk pre-feasibility and feasibility for those projects. Those are great starting points. The difficulty is when you look at a global scale, there are competing incentives for international organizations that makes it advantageous and disadvantageous in different countries and how they're being developed. I think stability has been a big I wouldn't call it an incentive, but it's an important factor. So having a world-class regulator, having experience in being able to create permitting and regulatory, those are all things that might not be an explicit incentive, but stability in policy, strong regulators are all things that enable project development. And I think those are things that will be really required because long-term certainty for projects over these long contracts are going to be really critical for someone to make a final investment decision on a project.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a really good point. Ultimately with these CCUS projects at industrial scale, we're asking people to make multi-billion-dollar investments that are likely going to have payouts over the period of decades. And so there does have to be that strong clarity and, I guess, expectation that those projects will have the right supports in place to be successful and ultimately be bankable and financeable over that sort of long time horizon. You did touch on the distinction between CCUS and carbon removal, so point source carbon capture versus removing carbon from the air via various methods. Can you maybe just unpack the roles of those different technologies, particularly as pertains to carbon neutrality, net zero, versus maybe at in individual facility level, we're looking at an emissions reduction, as you said, which can be achieved by point source carbon capture. But we know that for net zero, we actually have to go beyond just reducing a certain facility's emissions by 90 or 95%. So what is the role of removals on top of that?
Yeah, the really interesting part of that distinction is trying to remove or reduce every single molecule of carbon gets really expensive as you get closer to 100%. And so being efficient in the deployment of capital and resources is really, really important. The only way you can get to net zero is an all-of-the-above solution. And so as the opportunities that come with a carbon dioxide removal, which is often looked at as direct air capture or DAC, BECCS, bioenergy carbon capture and storage, those type of technologies have an interesting role because it actually can create a market. Those types of technologies will generate credits and then actually create potentially a commercial commodity for a price of CO2. Many of the carbon dioxide removals, those will be utilized by the organizations that are reducing them as part of their management process with their carbon footprint. But it's really important to see that if you are going to make those step changes in overall reduction of CO2, put it out in the atmosphere, these removals are the only way to get there. And while the criticism sometimes is that they're quite expensive, the step change with really smart people working on projects over time, globally, you can see those leaps and bounds happen. And it takes those leaders and those entrepreneurs and companies that have the vision to drive these technologies to advance. And I would say that, back to parallels with the oil and gas sector, the first horizontal well wasn't very straight, it wasn't very cheap, but now you look at how impactful that technology has scaled globally. And so that opportunity, again, the people working on interesting problems, and when you have something that's not economic, you really have a lot of people driving towards that path, and it might not be within every organization or person's risk tolerance. But I would say that the one thing that you do see over history is that there are people who will take that chance to advance and drive down those costs. And we've definitely seen that technology curve demonstrate how far you can actually watch the cost structures come down to enable these projects.
Yeah, really well said. And I'll just build on what we touched on earlier, which is, horizontal drilling is an example of a technology invented and perfected, some would argue, here in Alberta, and now it's exported worldwide. What if we could do the same thing with CCUS? And I think that's such a powerful question to ask. So I really like that example. And thanks very much for unpacking that distinction between removals and point source. I think that's maybe an underappreciated component of this conversation, is that for any facility or industry looking at capture as their pathway to net zero, again, they're going to get a certain portion of the way there with point source, and there's going to have to be a portion of removals to compensate for any remaining emissions or residual emissions, as they're called. But ultimately, we know, just technologically, most removals are going to be more expensive than point source capture. And so we do want to advance both those technologies in parallel, and we want to make sure we can go as far as we can with the point source before having to resort to the removals. So I think that's a really important distinction to underline. The other thing I picked up on from what you just said is the need for an all-of-the-above approach, and I think that's really, really important. We know that removals, we know that even point source capture is a finite resource in terms of the pore space, in terms of the capital, in terms of even just having the right number of welders to build these facilities all at the same time, right? So we really do need to prioritize the sectors, the facilities, the parts of the economy where that capture solution is going to be the most valuable from a climate mitigation perspective. So really great point there. We'll go now to a little bit of a discussion on the future, something we love to talk about here at ERA. So what's your vision for the future of CCUS, both in Alberta, Canada, and globally?
I'm very bullish on CCUS. I think conferences like GHGT just give you so much energy with the types of people who are in this area, in this sector, trying to advance it. And it being held in Calgary at its all-time high attendance and full rooms for technical talks and presentations is really what makes me excited about this area. It's not going to be easy, but it's also something that brings a lot of excitement in me in thinking about where it can go. CCS is global, and so when you look at all the different projects that are coming up and being built in a very short time frame, that lends itself to technologies advancing to grow at a faster scale. A lot of the incentives that the different countries are given are nearer term, and I know it's hard to think of 2030 as nearer term, but I do feel very certain that cost structures will go down as projects are being developed and as solutions are being learned. But the knowledge sharing across an area like this is actually quite unique compared to a conventional competitive technology process. The idea of common areas with common operators globally that they can all improve their performance and reduce their cost and help future projects are all amazing things that could really come forward. I do hope with Alberta that we, with the favorable geology, and I've had many conversations this week with delegates around the world that are just so envious of how cheap our storage and transportation is. And that, again, the experience we have with the energy regulators and experience with so many well penetrations in Alberta to know the geology, to have a lower risk in one area compared to the rest of the world is huge. I think it's important that things that can be developed here provincially and even in Saskatchewan provincially can be shared as other regions that don't have such favorable conditions are going to advance. I think learning from countries that have no choice but to go to offshore storage at very high costs, those may come in handy 20 and 30 years from now when it looks at Eastern Canada. So I think it's really important to think about all the benefits that carbon capture technology development in Canada will be longer term. It has a huge amount of jobs it can create. It also helps protect many of the Canadian industries that are emitters in this space. So I think there is a lot of great work being done where we've seen lots of recent announcements and we're hopeful to see more. So I'm very optimistic when it comes to how Canada will be able to still continue to be a leader, but a lot of the factors like making sure there's stability in policy, making sure that we have the incentives to compete on a global scale, those will be very, very important to project developers.
Yeah, fantastic. And one thing I heard you say is we need to get to this massive scale, and I think it's such a good observation that every technology that's now ubiquitous had to start with a first of a kind, and then a second of a kind, and then a third and a fourth. I really do think that CCUS, like many clean technologies, is one of these problems where we're going to have a 20-80 split, where the first 20% is really hard, and then all of a sudden we get to scale and we start seeing that acceleration for the last 80%. So I'm really excited to keep pushing us towards that inflection point. I'll also take your point around collaboration. I think that's such an underrated facet of the CCUS market. When it comes to a lot of other technologies, you're right, sectors compete internally, even sometimes within these international companies, you have facilities competing. When it comes to CCUS, none of these industries necessarily need to own their own CCUS IP. And so there is that opportunity for collaboration to bring in the vendors as partners and to share those learnings across jurisdictions and across sectors. So I think that's an underrated advantage that CCS does have. The energy and enthusiasm at GHGT this week has been, I guess, inspiring, to say the least. One thing I've certainly heard about, in addition to the points you noted, is a real focus on the role or the potential role of Indigenous participation in CCS projects. So why is that an important consideration, and how do you see that playing into the future of the CCUS industry?
Yeah, and Indigenous communities are going to play a really central role in CCUS development, especially in Alberta. I think the partnerships that we've actually seen between the energy industry and Indigenous communities gives us a lot of experience in being able to do this. I also think that the economic opportunity for all Canadians, especially Indigenous Canadians, this type of scale of development and build is just something that would really help bring things to the communities, bring great jobs. Those things are really important, but there's a lot of great track record in building and developing those relationships from a reconciliation point of view, but also an economic reconciliation point of view. This is one of the biggest opportunities that we have to be able to provide opportunities for communities to develop their own companies, high-paying jobs, good jobs, stable jobs over long term, while being respectful to the treaty lands in Alberta.
Another key concept that we've heard brought up repeatedly at GHGT 17 is risk. So in terms of risk mitigation, what are the key challenges that the industry needs to address to advance CCUS efforts? Could you please touch on a few that I think I've heard a lot here at GHGT? So that includes policy, supply chain issues, and workforce development.
Those are three pretty big ones. Policy certainty is really what I think everyone is trying to achieve. Looking at how those policies incentivize projects in different jurisdictions is something that often isn't done. And so understanding if you are at a disadvantage compared to 45Q or different policy incentives around the world, I think that's really important. But policy stability, I think we often know that with elections and government changes, it gives a reason for a project not to proceed. So I think that is one of the major ones are the policies going to stay stable and consistent over the life of a project? Because as you mentioned earlier, Chris, these are long-term projects. And to make a commitment, they want to make sure that there's as many knowns going forward as they can. Supply chain is often talked about as a very big issue. With the scale of these projects, looking at the type of skilled workers and the number is a concern, but it's also a big opportunity. It's a huge opportunity for innovation. It's an opportunity for jobs. It's an opportunity for people to work and participate in the sector. Training programs are definitely going to be needed as projects come through to make sure we have qualified operators, making sure the skilled trades are there. So when you really stand back, you can actually think about all the economic opportunities and participation that will actually hit across entire provinces. Even if you're not directly in the carbon capture space, this has a huge opportunity to impact. And different than the energy sector, this is a lot of different sectors, whether it be agriculture, cement, steel, oil and gas. There are so many more sectors involved, so many more communities involved. And so that ability to look at how much different regional impact is going to occur is really the positive side on trying to manage the challenges and risks that come with I would almost say a good problem to have, is to make sure that a supply chain can grow and adapt to do that. Another point is that the companies across the sectors, whether it be a constructor, a project developer, a technology provider, they're also looking at innovating. So the distribution of risks for an entire project, for a carbon capture project, are actually quite wide. We go all the way from an emitter all the way to storage. So in between that, there's a project developer, technology provider, transport, there's storage, there's measurement, monitoring, and verification, which we sometimes forget to talk about. Those parts is making sure that that risk and that value and reward is shared across that entire chain. So there is such a complexity across this industry that it creates a lot of creative and new and innovative ways of thinking, which I think creates opportunities across each of those parts of that value chain to be able to help enable these projects. And so as they create more certainty on what it takes to build a carbon capture project, the commercial arrangements are going to have to come with that, the certainty for pricing, and all those things is about, a lot of it is actually about sharing risk across the entire system where everyone benefits and shares in the risk of developing the project together.
James, we know that a big part of what you and your team do at the International CCUS Knowledge Center is to think about the best way to enable and support CCUS projects. So maybe if you can offer any advice to organizations that are pursuing projects in this area, what's the most impactful advice that, in a general sense, you can offer?
Be curious. I haven't been in this sector that long, but sometimes it feels quite long because of how new it is. There's a lot of things going on globally, and there's a lot of things to learn from. I also find this community to be wonderfully engaging and open to having conversations about what they can talk about and what they can't. That is what always is where you'd start, is asking questions, being connected, getting into that ecosystem, talking to all the different organizations around so that you can get your base footing. I often have seen some of the people who have worked with us look like a deer in the headlights, being tasked with this monumental problem and say, I make steel, I make cement, I don't build carbon capture projects. The easy part of getting onto that curve, seeing what's out there is a lot of information out there, but starting to sift through and connect with and meet the different types of people that you'll need to meet. And it's a very engaging community. As we've kind of pointed out with conferences like these, like GHGT, they're so valuable in actually meeting and hearing about organizations that you may have never heard before. Or people may be building a project that you've been trying to build for years. So that's always the part that I would say is be very curious. Look to see what you can learn from. I used to have a mentor that says, know what you don't know. And I think that was always a real guide, is if you know you don't know something, then you can go and do something and learn and continue to have those conversations. And people here will introduce you to other really, really smart people who you can actually, advance your project or steward to the right folks. And I think that's always something we pride ourselves on, is we know what we know and we know what we don't. But there's lots of people who know what we don't. And getting that entire community to advance this, because a lot of us who are in here are mission driven. We know what the impact is needed. Back to the question on the why, we know we need to take CO2 molecules out of the air. And so these are some of the all of the above solutions. It might not end up being the most dominant, but it's one of the few that we know that we can implement right away with commercially demonstrated projects.
So since we are here at GHGT 17, I'd be remiss, James, if I just didn't get your reaction to the conference, what you've seen, and any other, tidbits of information or insight that you've pulled out from the 4 days here.
Yeah, it's important to note that GHGT doesn't happen every year. It's a global conference. The last one was 2 years ago in Lyon, France, and the next one is in Perth, Australia. And so have it in our backyard was a huge advantage, especially for a not-for-profit like ours, where my technical team could come and present, participate in talks, and listen to all the technical plans that little hearts could desire. And so I have actually never seen my technical team as happy and cannot be as proud of as I can be of them in presenting in front of an international audience. You would also remind yourselves when you look at the panels, there's a lot of Alberta and Canadian representation. The organization that I work for has been around for a long time, but the Canadian presence at an international stage and the recognition by international communities of how we've been ahead and have been doing things is huge. And I mentioned on stage as much as a lot of the global activity has gone around, Canada is one of the biggest leaders in the volume of CO2 stored. While there's a lot of volume still to go, there hasn't been a molecule of CO2 stored in the UK yet, although they are working very diligently to be able to advance their projects, and they will. And it makes me very excited to see, as these conferences continue over time, what knowledge can be shared across a community that is all driving towards solving the same problem.
So we've mentioned before the amount of energy and enthusiasm that we're seeing here at the conference. And, one thing that I found really inspiring was at the opening night reception, we had our host get up on stage and say, okay, how many of you, this is your first GHGT? And the number of people who put up their hands was astonishing. So it's not just the old guard of the researchers who've been doing this their whole career. There is a whole new wave of new students, new researchers at the beginning of their career, people that are just starting out. And I think that's really exciting. And when you add to that the fact that we then asked, how many of you is your first time in Calgary? And I think about half the room put up their hand. That's also really exciting. We're bringing people here and we're showing them what we as a province, as a country, can do. And so I found that personally really inspiring. I know you had a similar reaction. So maybe if you want to take us through that and what your takeaway from that was.
What's interesting at this conference is there's a huge student component. And remembering my early days in my career of being one of the kids, and seeing people start their careers on a journey in an industry that has such an opportunity to grow and develop. It's such an amazing thing to be part of an organization that's growing and developing these skills that are transferable to these organizations and ultimately can transform a lot of new jobs as they evolve. It's something that when you get to look at full technical rooms all the way to the end of the day and bright and early filling out the room, it's hard to not be inspired by what the future holds and what these smart young people are going to be able to accomplish over their entire careers. We don't want to lose the opportunity to continue to build as a country and as a way to make sure the technologies that are developed here continue to be implemented here. If the incentives are to take those organizations and they can implement other places, while disappointing, it may actually create an opportunity for that technology to be implemented here. So the evolution of technologies of first of a kind to the second to the third to the scale of being commercial, we can't forget how fast that curve is and how quickly it can sneak up on you.